So far in our project, we have now a home page that's kind of filled out, and we have an about page that we can start to work on. Before we dive into the about page, we're gonna go back here and just kind of make an observation about how a lot of our sections are laid out. You notice that for when we have headers and paragraph and images, so far we only have control to lay them out vertically. So we go first the header, then the paragraph, then the image. We haven't really demonstrated the ability to have these next to each other, basically reading horizontally from left to right. And we'll try and do that in the about page. But before we can try that, we need to understand some concepts that are in play to get us to that point. I'm going to start by covering a CSS property, and this property is called display. I will link the W3 Schools documentation for this. We're basically going to go through this example here together, and then we'll start to incorporate it into our website. So before we actually do anything in our website, let's just do a little tutorial. So I'm closing down our website, opening up the tutorials. I'm gonna make a folder here, call this 6-1, and then we will call this display. Let's go ahead and make a new HTML file in that. I'll call this display.html. I'm also going to make a CSS as well, display.css. All right, so let's close everything down. I'm going to push this to the side, grab my template, and link it to the display CSS. Okay, so everything's kind of set up there, and let's kind of start to dive into this property. To demonstrate the difference with display, we're going to look at two elements to start with. I'll start with a paragraph here. I'm just going to write test paragraph. And then I'm going to add a tag we haven't seen before. This is called a span. Span kind of functions in a similar way to a paragraph, but we're going to notice a difference right away once we start adding some CSS in here. So now that I have both a paragraph and a span, I'm going to add some quick CSS to them. I'm just going to give them background colors. For the paragraph, we'll do aqua. And for the span, we'll just do, let's just do a light red or something, light coral. Save in both these, save in my HTML. And let's open it up to see the difference. Okay. So let's take a look. So here's our paragraph and here's our span. They both contain text, so they're meeting that purpose. But right away we can notice a large difference. The paragraph, when you add background color to it, it encompasses the whole width here. So we can see the width is written out. Basically it takes this whole section. Whereas the span does not. It just has this area. It doesn't take the space next to it. And this is the idea behind a display. We have different tags, and by default, they might take the whole width, or they might want to take part of the width. And we can change that if we want. Let us see if we can do that. I'm gonna just delete this, or leave the span for now. I'm just gonna add some sample text before the paragraph and after the paragraph. I'm going to copy this 4 times. So just Control C, Control V here. And I'm just going to have numbers for these. Test paragraph 1, test paragraph 2, 3, and 4. If I refresh this, okay, we basically see that these paragraphs here are splitting up these sample texts. Notice our code. So even though we're writing everything on the same line, when you hit the paragraph, it breaks the text here. It basically shoves it down. That's because the paragraph is occupying the whole space. If we do the same thing with span, so for example, if I do sample text before and after and save it, you'll notice that the span does not occupy the full width. It is basically written, we'd say, in line. The paragraph is not written in line. It gets its own line, so as soon as we read the paragraph tag, it takes a whole line, whereas a span does not. But we can change this if we want. Let's see how we can do that. I'm going to give each of these an ID. I'm just going to call it P1 for the paragraph 1, and then basically P2, 3, 4, etc. So each of these has its own ID, and that means we can change the CSS of each of them. Let's do that over here. Just going to close these down because we're not going to look at them. And let's change the display of paragraph 1 here. We'll do hashtag P1. Again, hashtag is the selector we use here for an ID. And then for this, we're going to do display. This is our new CSS property, and we have a few options. The first one we're going to look at is none. If we save this, now the CSS property of none is being applied to paragraph 1, this test paragraph 1 here. If we refresh our page, you can notice it disappeared. We have test paragraph 2, test paragraph 3, and test paragraph 4, but the test paragraph 1 is just gone. And technically it's written in the website, but display none just means don't display it. Now that might seem kind of useless, like why would we care about that? Why do we want a display of none? Later on in web design, you would learn JavaScript, which can turn things on or off. So there might be an option where if we click a button, we want something to go away. An easy way to do that would be use display none. So for now, we don't really have a purpose for it, but there is one in certain scenarios. Next step, let's do our second paragraph. Hashtag P2, display, and then we're going to do the display of inline. This will change how the paragraph looks for the second one, this paragraph 2 here. Let's observe. Here's what it was previously, and we refresh, and now you notice it's gotten thrown inside the text. What inline does is, instead of occupying the full width, you only get your allocated width. You only get the amount you ask for. So here, test paragraph 2 is just this much text. It's getting put in line here. So it gets put in the middle of all the other stuff. So essentially what inline does is what the span was doing by default. You can notice that the span down here, this was an inline. So like this one by default has a display of inline. But what about our paragraphs? What gave them this special property that has all this section here? Well, their display, and we'll do this in P3, the default display for a paragraph is block. And so what a block does is it occupies basically the whole width, and you can also change the height. So if I go over here and click refresh, nothing changes because we're just doing what the paragraph normally has. So by default, the paragraph has a display of block. It takes up the whole section. If we wanted to, we could change the span. We could do the span and have it have a display of block, and that will overwrite its default of inline. So if I add this in and refresh, now the span is essentially acting like a paragraph. It has a display of block. It takes the whole width. I'll roll that back now just so we can get used to a span normally having just that set width. Now we have one more. Let's do this one here, the test paragraph of 4. Hashtag P4. And the last one we'll look at is display inline block. It has both the kind of values we've looked at so far, inline and block. What it's going to do is it will make the text inline. So here, paragraph 4 is now inside all the other text. But it has an additional property that the other inline display does not. So let's look at our two examples. Paragraph 2 is inline, and paragraph 4 is also inline block. Let's see what happens if we change their heights. So for paragraph 2, we'll just be obnoxious here and we'll do height of 100 pixels. And we'll do the same thing for paragraph 4. So far we've been looking at putting them horizontally. This should make them larger vertically. Let us refresh over here. Okay. Now remember, we changed both the second paragraph and the fourth paragraph. But look here, only one of them has actually been affected. Test paragraph 2, it didn't get any bigger, whereas test paragraph 4 did get bigger. That's the difference between inline and inline block. Inline, you are inside the line, but you have no control over how big your height is. You're not a block, you're just part of the text inside. Whereas inline block, you are not only inline, but you have control over how large and small the vertical element is here. So these might be useful in different scenarios. If I was just using text and I don't want to mess around with height, I probably just want to use inline. But maybe there's something special about this element and it needs to grow vertically. In that case, I'll use inline block. So that's kind of a demonstration of these kind of 4 common displays: none, inline, block, and inline block. There are many others. We're actually going to look at one in a coming video, but these kind of give us just a general understanding of how displays work. Sometimes you take the full width with block, and sometimes you're put in the middle of the other content around you, in the case of inline.